Now I'm pleased to introduce Clive Richards, who, like Stuart, is an experienced researcher both here at the RAF Museum and at the Air Historical Branch. Clive's talk covers the Air Ministry's interpretations of the wartime history. Clive.
Good afternoon. Presenting the Air Force view, Air Ministry interpretations of the Royal Air Force's wartime history, 1945 to 1950. I know you will agree that, even though this may mean some delay, we must make sure that the Air Force view is fairly and squarely presented within the limits imposed by an officially sponsored publication. So noted the then Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, Air Marshal Sir Arthur Sanders, in a letter to Lord Trenchard dated the 26th of October 1950. Trenchard had telephoned Sanders on the previous day to press for the rapid publication of the air history then under preparation by the Air Ministry. While noting that we cannot see much hope of getting it out in the very near future, Sanders nevertheless reassured Trenchard that the Air Ministry was trying to get the history out as quickly as we reasonably can, and the need to do this has been impressed upon all those who are dealing with it. The air history in question was one of a number of avenues by which the Air Ministry sought to ensure that its own interpretation of the story of the RAF during the Second World War was fairly and squarely presented. This paper will discuss why such a view existed, the factors that helped to shape it, and how it was propagated within the service and to the public at large. In 1945, the task of shaping and presenting the RAF's war record was as much a question of public relations as it was of history. Responsibility for managing public relations within the Air Ministry was then vested primarily in the Directorate of Public Relations, which was part of the Department of the Permanent Under Secretary of State for Air. The importance of fostering a positive public image of the Royal Air Force had long been recognised by the Ministry. In his study of the relationship between British cinema and the wartime armed forces, Mackenzie observed that successive chiefs of the Ministry of Information, even when annoyed, noted that the Air Ministry was more publicity conscious than the other service departments. The war had heralded the rapid expansion of the Air Ministry's publicity machine. By May 1942, the total staff employed at the Air Ministry on all aspects of PR was 199, a figure that did not include overseas staff. According to Mackenzie, the degree of commitment the Air Ministry brought to promoting the RAF's public image did not go unnoticed. Brendan Bracken, who knew a fair bit about manipulating public opinion, thought that Air Vice Marshal Peck in particular was doing a tremendous job. Rear Admiral R.K. Dixon, Chief of Naval Information at the Admiralty, was envious of the immense and powerful organisation the Air Ministry had developed. Its success was obvious. A mass observation survey of public opinion in the autumn of 1941 revealed that the RAF was the most watched and most admired of the services. Little wonder that the competition began to talk of the Royal Advertising Force. The officer lauded by Bracken for doing a tremendous job was Air Vice Marshal Richard Peck. From February 1940, Peck had served as Assistant Chief of the Air Staff Operations and Intelligence, and subsequently as Assistant Chief of the Air Staff General. As such, his responsibilities included overseeing those aspects of DPR's work that impinged on the Air Staff's bailiwick. An appreciation that appeared in the Times following his death in September 1952 hailed Peck's appointment to this role as an unconscious stroke of genius. For he happened to possess ideal qualifications for the purpose, having an instinctive grasp of the needs and reactions of Fleet Street and a remarkable flair for news value, while his service experience and daily contacts with the air staff and commands gave him all the knowledge and authority required to justify security measures by way of censorship or refusal of facilities. Peck discussed the air staff aspects of public relations in a lecture delivered to the RAF's Staff College, its 15th War Course in May 1945. During wartime, he argued, it was vital for the individual service departments to present the policy and achievements of its service effectively. Otherwise, public morale is adversely affected, and the policy of the conduct of the war and the actual prosecution are hampered by the expression and effect of public uneasiness. Public confidence and morale in the conduct of the war affects the endurance of the public, their savings, war output, and the efficiency of all other activities of the state engaged in total war. Prestige abroad and all the advantages it conveys equally depend upon the presentation abroad of the achievements of the state and especially of the fighting services. Moreover, the importance of fostering a wider awareness of the activities of the services went beyond its impact on civilian morale. The morale of the fighting forces themselves also depends a great deal, Peck argued, upon their knowing through their own reading and hearing of the news that the public recognise and value their services and achievements. By the time of Peck's address at the Staff College, the war in Europe had come to a close. The prospect of peace, however, did not mark the end of the Air Ministry's public relations efforts. In peace, according to Peck, if the work and needs of the service and the essential tasks it performs for the state are not effectively presented by the department, the public will not appreciate the necessity for the sacrifices in taxation and in other ways which they have had to make to provide the service. The public have had to make great sacrifices and are entitled to know what they're getting for them and why they are necessary. The obtaining of the right quality and number of recruits and the provision of the most up-to-date weapons and equipment depends on a right public understanding of these matters. Senior air staff officers accepted that this right public understanding would need to be based upon a favourable interpretation of the RAF's wartime record. The air staff aspect of public relations will be of the utmost importance after the war if we are to preserve the RAF intact and withstand pressure of those who would dismember it. Peck emphasised in a memo to Air Marshal Sir Douglas Everall, the Vice Chief of the Air Staff, in December 1944. The VCS would have appeared to have accepted the validity of Peck's argument. The next year or so is going to be an important and possibly difficult period from the point of view of public relations, Everall acknowledged in a minute to the Chief of the Air Staff, Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Charles Balkhill, on the 7th of August 1945, and it will be of the highest importance both to the service and to the nation that RAF achievements and potentialities are properly put over to the public and the world. In addition to being a means of extolling the continued value of the RAF, the service's recent history was also seen by many as a valuable guide to the conduct of future operations. During the last year, Everall reflected at the beginning of a minute portal dated the 27th of September 1944, I have received several requests from the Secretary of State and from you, also recommendations from the Inspector General and from commands to consider various aspects of air staff organisation. One of the three issues identified was the crystallisation of air staff doctrine as evolved from war experience to form a basis for future policy and for the work of the public relations staff. To address this issue, an attached memorandum included the recommendation that a Directorate of Staff duties be re-established. After some discussion, formal Treasury approval for the creation of such a directorate was sought by the Air Ministry on the 11th of January 1945. The setting up of this directorate, according to the latter's FDENI, aims at assisting a CASG from whom certain operational functions have been taken to concentrate on matters of air staff doctrine and the air staff aspects of public relations. It is quite clear that the existence of such a directorate will be essential in peacetime, and although the case of forming such a directorate now is perhaps less clear, we are satisfied that if matters of air staff doctrine are to develop and crystallise as they should, a directorate, alongside but detached from both operations and policy, is necessary now. DSD, who will work in close cooperation with the Air Historical Branch, will have one deputy whose charge will include the preparation of operational monographs and formulation of future doctrine for the guidance of the RAF Staff College commands, etc. As Denny noted in his letter of the 11th of January, DSD was intended to operate closely with the Air Historical Branch. The origins of this branch can be traced back to the Air Historical Section, established within the Committee of Imperial Defence Secretariat in 1918 to support the writing of the official history of British Commonwealth air operations during the First World War, the War in the Air. With the completion of the sixth and final volume of the War in the Air on the 3rd of February 1936, AHB ceased to exist as a separate organisation, and the staff and collection of records were transferred to the Air Ministry Library. On the outbreak of war, however, steps were rapidly put in hand to re-establish a separate historical office within the Air Ministry. These efforts were guided by the Air Ministry librarian, John Coombs-Nerney, who had first joined the Air Historical Section in August 1919 and had subsequently served as a member of AHB until its dissolution. An Air Ministry order promulgated on the 20th of November 1941 announced that it had been decided that steps should now be taken to collate the records and proceed with the compilation of preliminary narratives necessary for the production of the official history of the war. To this end, an historical branch of the Air Ministry, short title AHB, to which narrators have been appointed, has been formed under the control of the librarian and will, in future, deal with all matters relating to the RAF history, including the collection and custody of historical documentary material. By the end of 1945, therefore, three elements within the Air Ministry, DPR, DSD and AHB, were in some way involved with researching, shaping and presenting the RAF's wartime history to audiences within and beyond the Air Ministry and the wider RAF. However, they all form part of the Air Ministry's extensive wartime administration, a structure that would prove unsustainable once the shooting stopped. The drive to whittle down Whitehall had begun prior to the end of hostilities in Europe and further intensified following the surrender of Japan. A vast amount of contraction, reorientation and reconstruction lies before the Air Ministry, the PUS Sir Arthur Street, lamented in a letter to Eville on the 26th of September 1945. I therefore earnestly ask you to consider carefully your present strength of staff and the work for which you are responsible, with a view to cutting out as soon as possible any work which can be eliminated or postponing work which can wait over. One early victim of the ensuing cold was the post of ACAS G, the abolition of which was announced on the 6th of October 1945. The Air Ministry's public relations staff were also in the firing line. When in May 1945, Group Captain Lord Willoughby de Brooke was invited by the Secretary of State for Air, Sir Archibald Sinclair, to assume the position of Director of Public Relations, it was on the understanding that he would effect substantial reductions in establishment now the German war is over. In 1947, the Air Ministry's PR organisation reverted to something approaching its pre-war state with the appointment of a civil servant, Lionel Murray McBride, as Chief Information Officer. By 1950, McBride headed an information division in POS's department that consisted of just 25 posts, almost all of which were occupied by civilians. The scaling back and eventual dissolution of DPR through the onus for presenting the Air Force view of its history upon AHB and DSD. Their functions differed, one concentrating on the origin and definition of operational and tactical doctrine and air staff function, and the other producing a factual historical narrative, a function of research. Nevertheless, it was argued from the outset that they should work in the closest cooperation, There is room for both branches. There is much ground to be covered. AHB's efforts centred upon the production of fully authenticated factual narratives that included all relevant facts and copies of key papers. By 1945, 2 series had been established. The first consisted of operational narratives compiled with the primary object of simplifying the task of the ultimate historian of the air war. Narrators were tasked with condensing the broad mass of air material relative to his subject into a preliminary narrative, which the historian can accept as a guide and leading authority on the campaign concerned. In addition, the narratives were intended to serve as works of reference for the Air Ministry and staff colleges. Conversely, the second series comprised specialist monographs intended to provide a historical survey on the subject concern for the Air Ministry, staff colleges, and appropriate units in the RAF, while serving additionally as sources of reliable and conveniently presented information for use of the official historian, thereby enabling him to acquire adequate technical background to the operational story. By this stage, the notion of an overarching official history of British air operations had already been overtaken by events. AHB's narratives and monographs were nevertheless drawn upon to varying degrees by those charged with preparing the inter-service official histories. AHB also provided considerable research support to individual authors. In the preface to The Defence of the United Kingdom, for example, Colley acknowledged Mr. Nerney and his staff as having been indefatigable in searching for records on my behalf, and he is giving me much help and encouragement. Looking beyond the confines of official history, AHB and DSD, which was renamed subsequently the Directorate of Command and Staff Training, or DST, also worked in tandem to raise awareness of the RAF's contribution to the Allied war effort by other means. Assistance was provided to authors, particularly those with a service background, seeking to write popular accounts of the RAF at war. Arguably the most successful example of such report was initiated by the Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief RAF Transport Command, Air Marshal Sir Ralph Cochrane. Cochrane had commanded No. 5 Group RAF Bomber Command between 1943 and 1945, and in December 1946 he wrote to Nerney to ask whether there is any objection from the Air Ministry's point of view of engaging a civilian to write a squadron history of one of the squadrons within his group, namely No. 617 Squadron. Nerney wrote in turn to the Director of Staff Duties, Group Captain Theodore McAvoy, to press the case. Having regard to the outstanding service of this particular squadron, it is, I am sure you will agree, quite definitely in the best interest of the Royal Air Force that the history should be produced, and that we should do all in our power to ensure that a really first-class account is produced. McAvoy concurred with the proviso that the text should be forwarded to the Air Ministry for approval before any steps are taken to publish it. Nerney would go on to play a key role in recruiting Paul Brickhill to write what would become the Dam Busters, and would help steer the resulting text through Air Ministry clearance and into print. Another tool employed was the preparation of an authorised preliminary history of the RAF. In September 1946, the duties of DSD included air aspects of official and interim histories in liaison with the Air Historical Branch, the production of interim or preliminary histories of each service pitched between popular histories already published and the full official history, was recommended by the Committee for the Control of Official Histories and approved by the Cabinet on the 3rd of April 1945. In addition to making available the RAF's wartime story to the general public, many within and beyond the Air Ministry also perceived the preliminary history as a means of forwarding the cause of the RAF vis-à-vis the other services. The need to preempt the equivalent British Army and Royal and Navy histories was therefore seen as paramount. I am more than anxious that this history should be published as early as possible, Lord Trenchard urged Sanders on the 30th of October 1950. I am frightened that it will not be ready for another year, and then it will be too late. All the others will be out. Trenchard was to be disappointed. Although the first draft had been submitted to the Air Ministry, it was in many ways unsuitable for publication, and it was only after considerable revision that in 1953, the first of 3 volumes in the series, The Fight at Odds, was published. A similar view with regard to inter-service relations coloured the Air Ministry's approach to the thorny issue of dispatches by Commanders-in-Chief. Although scrutiny of service dispatches and the preparation of RAS commanders' dispatches for publication fall within DST's remit, there would appear to have been little enthusiasm for the task. To Portal, as a survival from the days before wireless and the telegraph, they were an anachronism. Nevertheless, given that the service departments were committed in principle to the publication of dispatches, Street's successor as PUS, Sir William Brown, advised the Air Council in December 1945 that the RAF had therefore to produce dispatches to balance those of the other services. The Council concluded reluctantly that the preparation of any additional reports which would be needed to balance the other 2 service departments should be put in train. One consequence of this policy was that a number of dispatches completed during wartime were deemed unnecessary or outdated and never saw the light of day. Additionally, concerns with regard to security also prevented the publication of certain dispatches, notably those compiled by Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, relating to his tenure as AOC&C Bomber Command, and those by successive AOC&C's Coastal Command. Although these texts were made available internally for reference and training purposes, either in form or in the form of précis. By 1951, only 14 RAF dispatches had made it as far as the London Gazette. The Air Ministry thus used various means to foster a positive view of the RAF's history in the years following the end of the war. Although much of this was aimed at fostering the right public understanding advocated by PEC, this positive interpretation was also of considerable value in fostering esprit de corps within the service itself at a time of considerable change. However, the requirement to distill lessons from the conflict required a more clinical approach. The end of the war saw the RAF deficient in doctrinal publications. Many simply did not exist, while those that did, notably the RAF's capstone doctrinal text, Air Publication AP 1300, Royal Air Force War Manual Part 1 Operations, were sadly outdated. In an effort to address this doctrinal void, Treasury approval was obtained in June 1947 for the appointment of a temporary 3-man Air Staff Manual Committee to work with the DST. Part of the committee's responsibilities included preparation of the final drafts of a series of functional manuals then being prepared by the ST and the appropriate operational deputy directorates, dealing with maritime air operations, air transport, bomber operations, fighter operations, land air warfare, and service writing. However, such was the importance of AP 1300 that the committee's chair was tasked not with overseeing the writing of a new edition, but rather with writing it himself. Although the then ABM Sanders had been earmarked to chair the committee, circumstances precluded him from taking up this role, and a retired officer, Air Marshal John Breen, was appointed in his stead. By the end of 1948, Breen had completed a draft of the revised edition of AP 1300, and DST duly circulated this draft around the air staff and to commands and the staff colleges for comment. Breen's draft is noteworthy in as far as it contained only fleeting references to the conflict just ended. A handwritten note on the covering loose minute indicates that it was regarded as being out of date as early as 1949, and that a revised draft was soon to be circulated by the ST. Work towards production of the new edition continued during that year, and in January 1950, the new edition was duly released for the information and guidance of all concerned. In contrast with Breen's draft, the new edition included numerous examples drawn from wartime experience. Nevertheless, something of a question mark would appear to have remained as to their validity as sources of current and future doctrine. One of the RAF's foundational documents, the second report of the Smuts Committee on Air Organisation and Home Defence Against Air Raids, had predicted that the day might not be far off where aerial operations, with the devastation of enemy lands and destruction of industrial and populous centres on a vast scale, might become the principal operations of war, to which the older forms of military and naval operations may become secondary and subordinate. Now, a raft of new technologies, notably the development of atomic weapons, promise to make good on Smuts' prediction and led some senior officers to question the value of lessons drawn from the Second World War. The rate of technological development is so rapid, and the effects of changes in technique are so far-reaching that it is fatal to lag behind, Marshal of the Royal Air Force Lord Taylor cautioned in 1947. For our own security and for the strength behind UNO, the United Nations Organization, we must think in terms of modern war. The last war is not modern, it is out of date. A similar note of warning was reflected in the introduction to the new edition of AP 1300 provided by a successor, Air Chief Marshal Sir John Cesar. It is the duty of all Air Force officers to acquire a thorough knowledge and understanding of the contents of this manual, Cesar acknowledged. At the same time, however, while this manual contains the air staff doctrine of today and is to be accepted as the basis of all training in the service, it must not be regarded as the last word. The art and technique of air warfare are in a constant state of evolution. The main objective of this and all manuals is to fit the service to fight in the event of another war. And if one thing is reasonably certain about any future war, it is that it will be different, not only from the last one, but also from the popular conception of the next. From the foregoing, therefore, it can be seen that by the end of the Second World War, the air industry was well versed in the necessity to project a favourable image of the RAF to the world at large. During the war itself, this task had been seen largely as a matter of public relations. However, in the immediate post-war period, the RAF's wartime history moved from the news to history, albeit of the most contemporary type. The task of shaping and projecting this history duly shifted from the ministry's greatly reduced PR staffs to those now charged with researching, recording and interpreting the past, the Historical Branch and the Directorate of Staff Duties. Between 1945 and 1950, the Air Ministry projected different messages to differing audiences. In the public arena, they sought to portray the wartime history of the RAF in such a way as to emphasise the worth of the service's achievements and the valour and sacrifice of those who made them possible. In something of an extension of the RAF's pre-war struggles, the Air Ministry also sought to emphasise the relative value of the RAF's contribution alongside those of the older, more established services, and by extension, the continued relevance of the RAF as a separate air force. Internally, these messages were also a useful tool in fostering a distinctive service identity. However, the air staff would appear to have been somewhat more equivocal with regard to the utility of the RAF's wartime history as a source of doctrine. It was certainly the case that mechanisms were put in place to distill the lessons of wartime experience, and that these lessons were reflected in the Air Ministry's first major post-war doctrinal publication. Nevertheless, there are indicators that by 1950, there was an increasing sense that the pace of technological advance had gone some way towards nullifying the value of looking to the past when preparing for an uncertain future.